Thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. Thank you for that kind introduction. It is a tremendous, tremendous honor to be here. I really can't say what an honor it is. So thank you, everyone, so much. I'd like to begin tonight by telling you how I came to write a book on decision-making, especially after writing a book on Proust and Gertrude Stein and Virginia Woolf. And I had the epiphany in a supermarket. This was one of those palatial American supermarkets, one of those ones that, you know, in the suburbs that goes on forever and ever and makes the local Sainsbury's seem miniature. And my wife and I recently had gotten our things together, and we were at the checkout line putting stuff on the conveyor belt when we remembered that we'd forgotten to buy breakfast cereal. So I was sent back to the cereal aisle, which was like a quarter mile away, with relatively straightforward instructions, which was to buy a box of Cheerios. So I run back to the cereal aisle, reach for the yellow box of original Cheerios, only to see right next to that box of Cheerios a box of Honey Nut Cheerios. And I think to myself, you know, Honey Nut Cheerios are much more delicious than regular Cheerios. I should buy the Honey Nut Cheerios. So I reach for the box of Honey Nut Cheerios, only to see right next to that a box of multigrain Cheerios. And I think, you know, I should get more fiber in my diet. I should eat the multigrain Cheerios. Only to see that multigrain Cheerios cost $3.99. And that the generic Cheerios, the generic brand, cost $2.99. So I reach for the box of generic Cheerios. I'll spare you my entire interior monologue. But a few minutes go by and I catch my wife out of the corner of my eye looking at me like I've lost my mind because I can't pick a box of Cheerios. And it was, yeah, I mean, Cheerios was the least of my problems. You should see me in the floss aisle. You know, it was that everyday failure which I think first got me interested in the subject of decision-making. I wanted to know, number one, what was happening inside my mind as I struggled and failed to pick a box of breakfast cereal, and number two, more importantly, what should have been happening inside my mind as I tried to pick a box of breakfast cereal. And for a long time, I think we've had this very simple, elegant, it makes great sense model of decision-making, which is that the best way to make a decision, the best way to choose a box of Cheerios is to be as rational as possible. This goes all the way back to Plato and the ancient Greeks. Plato's very famous model of the mind, this is a metaphor which was picked up by Freud and is, you know, really a pretty canonical model, was that the mind is like a charioteer. There's this rational rider, and the job of the rational rider is to keep a tight rein on the emotional horses, to make sure these emotional horses don't run wild. So the best decision makers are simply the most rational. They make sure their emotional horses don't lead them in the wrong direction. So reason is good, emotions are bad. There were obviously a few dissenters, David Hume, Adam Smith, people who said, well, maybe our emotions aren't simply these irrational, impulsive, impetuous things. But for the most part, this was the basic model. Freud actually just plagiarized this model, you know, completely from Plato. When he wasn't talking about the chariot itself, he'd talk about it in terms of the id and the ego and the superego. So it was a very influential model of decision-making. The problem with this model, as elegant as it is that it's mostly wrong. And I think some of the most powerful evidence for just how misguided this metaphor of the mind is comes from the work of a neurologist named Antonio Damasio, who in the early 1980s began studying patients who, because of a brain tumor in their frontal lobes, lost the ability to experience emotion. So all these subtle feelings of pleasure and fear and anxiety that we take for granted, they couldn't experience. And you'd think if you were Plato that these people would be philosopher kings, that they would make the best set of decisions possible because they had no emotional horses to lead them astray. So they were just this rational charioteer. They could be perfectly rational. But instead what you find is that these people became pathologically indecisive. They were like me in the cereal aisle, only 10 times worse. They would spend all day trying to figure out where to eat lunch. And then once they chose a place, they'd spend the next 2 hours trying to choose between a tuna fish salad sandwich or a chicken salad sandwich. Damasio tells this great story about watching one of his patients. He had to sign a patient form, and he gave the patient 2 pens, a blue pen and a black pen. And the patient spent an hour and a half trying to choose between these 2 pens. He came up with all sorts of reasons why the blue pen might be better because, you know, the document was in black, so maybe the blue would stand out more. They come up with all sorts of really good reasons why the black pen might be better. Well, because it does go with the text. And endlessly confabulating reasons. And because there was no basic emotional signal just saying, shut up already, choose the blue pen, they went on and on and on, and they could have gone on all day. So I think what patients like this, what these very sad, tragic stories illustrate, is that pure reason isn't something to aspire to. Pure reason is actually a disease. And this, I think, should help us reconceptualize how we think about decision-making and the importance of emotions in the decision-making process. So I'd like to begin the talk tonight by telling you a story. And this is one of those stories that, as a writer, as soon as you hear this story, you know you want to write about it. You have no idea what you're going to say about it. You have no idea what's going to go in a book or an article, but you know you want to tell it. It's a story that takes place in the second day of the ground invasion of the First Persian Gulf War. Lieutenant Commander Michael Riley is in the radar room of the HMS Gloucester, and his job that day is to watch out for Silkworm missiles. These are massive Chinese-made missiles used by the Iraqi military. And he's got to make sure that none of these missiles breach his radar defenses and strike the Allied fleet, the convoy of American battleships, destroyers, and 2 aircraft carriers that are behind him in the Persian Gulf. So it's 5:01 in the morning, pre-dawn hours, and he sees 2 radar blips, 2 neon green radar blips, appear right off the Iraqi coast near the Kuwaiti border. And as soon as he sees these radar blips, he's seized by this very intense feeling of fear, this powerful and terrifying emotion. You know, his hands get clammy, his pulse starts to race, sweat starts to pool above his upper lip. He's convinced that these 2 blips are Iraqi Silkworm missiles. So as soon as he sees these 2 blips, he tells his missile officer to prepare the sea darts. These are these sea-to-air missiles that are capable of shooting down the Silkworm missiles. But here's his problem. He knows that these 2 radar blips have appeared off the coast and are traveling in the path that's identical to American A-6 and F-18 Hornet fighter jets. So these planes, for the last 5.5 weeks, Michael Riley's been watching them take off from the aircraft carriers behind him, drop their bombs in Iraq, and then go wet feet. That's the technical terminology for when they become visible on his naval radar at this exact same spot, and they travel along the exact same route back to their aircraft carriers where they land. So here's his question. Should he fire these sea darts? You know, how does he know if these blips are Silkworm missiles or A-6 fighter jets? He's got this very powerful, this very, very powerful emotion telling him they're Silkworm missiles, but maybe his emotion's wrong. He also knows rationally that he can't distinguish between these blips, that he can't justify his decision. He's got 45 seconds to make up his mind. So, try to imagine how agonizing this decision is. If he fires the sea darts, and these are 2 A-6 fighter jets, then 4 American pilots are about to die. He'll be court-martialed, his career will be over. He's going to have to tell his commanding officer that he killed these pilots because he got scared one morning. At the same time, if he doesn't fire his sea darts, and these are Silkworm missiles, then the USS Missouri is about to be sunk. Hundreds of sailors will die. It'll be the most devastating encounter of the Persian Gulf War for the Allies. So what does he do? Time's up, and he gives the order to fire. He watches as these blips race towards each other, as his sea darts shoot down the Silkworm. The 2 Silkworm missiles end up falling out of the sky about 700 yards in front of the USS Missouri. So it was that close. Then the question becomes, what did he shoot down? And needless to say, the next few hours are the longest hours of Michael Riley's life as he waits to see what these blips were. They send crews to scour the wreckage. Michael Riley is sent back to study the tapes to come up with some reason, any reason to justify his decision to fire the sea darts, and he comes back empty-handed. He says, I can't justify my decision. I just knew they were Silkworm missiles. 4 hours later, they eventually determined that they were Silkworm missiles, and Michael Riley was a hero and that he saved the USS Missouri. One interesting thing I've learned since writing the book, and this is one of the really great things about writing a book and then people read it and write to you, is I heard from a naval commander who was actually there that day, and he said one of the oddest things that the U.S. Navy found in their investigation was that the more advanced radar systems used on the American ships, and they had an AWACS plane in the air watching out for Silkworm missiles too, that these more advanced radar systems, they were largely computerized. They looked for aberrant patterns. And that because these Silkworm missiles were traveling along this path, all these more advanced radar systems simply assumed they were A-6 fighter jets. So Michael Riley was the only person scared that morning at 5:01 in the morning. All the other eyes in the sky, all the other people in the radar rooms just assumed these were, routine A-6 fighter jets, just a little bit ahead of schedule, nothing to worry about. It was only this one man seized with this emotion of fear who realized, well, maybe they're Silkworm missiles. So after the war was over, the British Navy launched an investigation to figure out how exactly Michael Riley knew these were Silkworm missiles and not A-6 fighter jets. And their conclusion, their investigation of the tapes that morning, they concluded that Michael Riley was a hero, but he was just a lucky hero. He got lucky. He could have just as easily shot down two American aircraft. So that was the way the case was closed. That was where the case stood until Gary Klein a cognitive psychologist who's probably best known for his investigations of the intuitions of firefighters. But he's also a consultant from the Marine Corps. He got intrigued by this story of Michael Riley, so he went back to the radar tapes. Only he didn't just look at the radar tapes from that morning. He went back and looked at the radar tapes from the previous 5.5 weeks. He was looking for some subtle discrepancy, some subtle clue that could explain Michael Riley's emotion, and maybe it wasn't just a lucky coincidence that he got very scared at that precise moment when he saw these two blips. And sure enough, Gary Klein found that there was a discrepancy. It was a very subtle discrepancy, but it was clear. The discrepancy was this, that because A-6 fighter jets and F-18 Hornets travel between 3,000 and 10,000 feet, they went wet feet. They became visible on the naval radar as soon as they hit the Persian Gulf. So within a single sweep of the radar, and we've all probably seen those, those Tom Clancy movies where they show the radar screen. So within a single sweep of that radar band, they became visible. The Silkworm missiles, because it was traveling at 1,000 feet, didn't become visible until 4 to 5 seconds later on the third sweep of the radar. So even though these blips were traveling along the exact same spatial path, there was a subtle timing difference. This blip appeared a little too far to see, a little too late. And it was that timing difference, Gary Klein argued, that generated this feeling of fear that led Michael Riley to give the order to fire the Sea Darts and save the USS Missouri. Now, I love this story because it could be in a Tom Clancy novel, because it's, got all the necessary ingredients of suspense and all the rest. It should be in a Hollywood blockbuster. But I also love it because I think it explains something very important about how our brain works. And in the book, I talk about this Michael Riley incident in terms of dopamine. Dopamine's a neurotransmitter that for a long time, it's a neurotransmitter, which means it's used by brain cells to communicate with each other. And for a long time, it had a bad reputation. It was the neurotransmitter of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was the chemical that, made us eat too much chocolate cake and indulge in crack cocaine. And dopamine is still responsible for all those things. It is the chemical behind hedonism, but it turns out it's also responsible for something much more interesting, which is it's in part what allows us to make sense of reality, to find patterns and causation and correlation in the real world, to transform the helter-skelter of reality into a world we can understand and make predictions about. I think some of the most interesting work on dopamine has been done by a Cambridge neuroscientist named Wolfram Schultz. He began studying the dopamine system in large part because of Parkinson's. He wanted to find Parkinson's is caused by the death of dopamine neurons, and he was interested in this model and how dopamine neurons might encode movement. But he quickly discovered that dopamine neurons also encode rewards. And so he set up this very elegant paradigm where he would give a monkey a squirt of juice and record from individual neurons in the monkey midbrain. And what he found was that you give a monkey a squirt of juice and these dopamine neurons will fire, which makes sense in terms of dopamine as a hedonic meter, that it's processing rewards. So the monkey says, squirt of apple juice, delicious, and you get this burst of pleasure. But then Schultz found something interesting, which is that if you keep on giving the monkey these squirts of apple juice, before long it gets bored. The dopamine neurons habituate, they adapt, they stop sending out these pleasurable signals. And that makes sense. It's why, that new iPod makes you very happy for a couple days, then it's just another thing in your pocket, or why the first bite of chocolate cake is really delicious and the fifth bite is a little bit boring. That because your pleasure cells, these dopamine neurons, they quickly get bored by the reward itself. But then one day Schultz is walking into his lab and he opens the door and he hears the distinctive snap, crackle, pop of dopamine neurons firing. And he thinks, that's kind of interesting. I wonder why they'd fire when I open the door. And then he thinks, well, maybe these neurons are predicting rewards. Maybe they know that every time I open the door to my lab, they're soon going to be getting apple juice. So then he sets up this very, very elegant system where he rings a bell, and this is all based on the work of Pavlov and classical conditioning. He rings a bell and gives the monkey a squirt of apple juice, and before long he finds these dopamine neurons fire when he rings the bell, and not when he gives them a squirt of actual juice. So the reward itself is boring. They want to find the event that predicts the reward. And if you flash a light before ringing a bell, before giving a squirt of apple juice, they'll fire when you flash the light. And if you play a song before flashing a light, before ringing a bell, before giving them a squirt of apple juice, they'll fire when you play the song. In other words, they want to find the event furthest back in time that predicts the reward. They want to find the rewarding pattern. The reward itself is boring. They don't really care about the apple juice. They want to find the thing that predicts the apple juice. He calls these cells prediction neurons because that's what they do. They're interested in predicting rewards. Now you can begin to understand how these cells might be incredibly useful. The monkey that can predict the arrival of the bananas or whatever it is monkeys eat farthest in advance will get the most of them. They can recognize the symptoms of a reward far out there in time, and then say, okay, I know where I have to be to get these bananas. So it allows you to discern patterns in the real world and to maximize the rewards based on these patterns. But then the question becomes, how do these cells actually work? How do they actually know that the bell precedes the juice? How do they learn? I mean, this is just a discrete small circuit of cells. How do they actually learn that these different events predict the reward? And this is where something called the prediction error signal comes in handy. The prediction error signal results, it's a very specific signal that you can detect from dopamine neurons. So let's say you're in a sadistic mood. So you've trained this monkey to, flash a light, ring a bell, squirt of juice. But then one day you decide, well, why don't I just, play the song, flash a light, ring the bell, and not give the monkey a squirt of juice? What happens then? Then you find that these dopamine neurons get very upset, that they release this prediction error signal. That's their signal saying, uh-oh, something's wrong. This pattern we expected didn't come true. We've made a wrong set of predictions. And that turns out to be a crucial learning signal. It sends a signal to your brain saying, we got to rejig our expectations. We got to figure out, because these predictions we made about rewards, those predictions were wrong. And so then they try to minimize that error difference and then make a whole new set of predictions. Maybe the light doesn't predict the bell after all. Maybe the bell doesn't predict the juice. I asked a scientist, how would you describe what this prediction error signal feels like? It's obviously a negative emotion, but do you ever encounter something in your own life that reminds you of prediction error signal? And he described it to me like this. So you've had a really tough day at the office. You have to work all morning really hard and finishing up some project. It's 2 p.m. You have to skip lunch to finish this project. You're really, really hungry. You just want a Snickers bar or some candy bar from the vending machine. So you walk down the hall to the vending machine. You're really hungry. You see the candy bar you want. You put in the 4 coins, 1 coin, 2 coins, 3 coins, 4 coins. You type in the secret code, the code in the vending machine, CO4. You watch as the candy bar comes forward on the robotic arm. Then right before it drops off into the spot where you can reach it, the candy bar gets stuck. It's stuck on the robotic arm. And that's the prediction error signal. It's that feeling of wanting to hit the machine, shake the machine, do anything to the machine to get your candy bar. That's that same feeling of frustration and anger. That's what a prediction error signal feels like. Now this turns out to be an incredibly efficient way to learn. Just in the last couple of years, people have begun applying this to computational systems like banks of elevators, cell phone towers. The best backgammon player in the world is now a simple software program that can run on any laptop that uses what's called temporal difference learning, which is a variant of prediction error learning. So this turns out to be unbelievably efficient. You can very quickly discern the patterns in be it backgammon or cell phone transmissions and develop these models that maximize return, so to speak. And this is something we've picked up from dopamine neurons. Natural selection over millions and millions and millions of years found this very elegant computational algorithm that allows us to learn and learn very quickly and to know when the patterns we've learned to perceive aren't quite right. So now back to Michael Reilly. I think you can take this prediction error signal and begin to understand what was happening inside his brain that morning. So it's 5:01 in the morning. And his brain, which has been spent 5.5 weeks looking at one very specific pattern of activity. He's been watching these fighter jets hit the Persian Gulf at this exact same spot, travel along the exact same route back to the aircraft carriers. But this morning, something very slight is off. There's a slight timing delay. So some dopamine neuron somewhere in his midbrain fires a prediction error signal, says the pattern I've come to expect, this isn't quite it. So that signal is passed from synapse to synapse until it reaches a brain area called the anterior cingulate cortex, which many scientists refer to as the oh shit circuit. And it's triggered by things like negative surprise, contradictions, cognitive dissonance, stuff like that. That generates this terrifying feeling of emotion and fear, and that, I would argue, is what allowed him to realize that what he was staring at wasn't an A-6 fighter jet. What he was staring at was a Silkworm missile, and that's when he gave the order to fire. Now, what I think you can gain by looking at emotions through the lens of dopamine is it does overturn, I think, this old view of our emotions, the conventional wisdom that our emotions are these impulsive, impetuous things, that they're bad things. They lead us astray. They're these animal passions we do our best to ignore and keep a tight rein on. And I think what dopamine reveals is that your emotions can be bad. They can lead you to all sorts of dumb stuff. but they also can reflect this astonishing amount of computation and analysis. And the reason we think these emotions may be impulsive or we don't trust them is because we're not aware of what they're computing. We're not aware of what facts in the real world they're responding to and relying on. But the fact is they can be deeply empirical. They're very interested in the real world. This processing just takes place, underneath the surface of consciousness, in the unconscious brain. But I think this should teach us to at the very least, take our emotions when they're based on something real, when they're based on experience and patterns, take them seriously. But now, I certainly don't want to give you the impression that I think we should always just, trust our sweaty, clammy hands, trust our racing pulse, trust our fear or our emotions, that we should always just go with our gut. That'd be terrible, terrible advice. And I think the most interesting thing to me about this new science of decision-making is that you can see that the exact same system which works so well in the radar room can be so helpful in terms of monkeys and rewards, can also lead us to do utterly idiotic things, can ruin our life and lead us to make choices that are utterly against our interest. And in the book I talk about this in terms of the case of Anne Kleinestever. She was a high school English teacher in West Virginia, in a small town in West Virginia, when at the age of 55 she was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And one of the best Parkinson's, as I said before, is caused by the massive cell death of dopamine neurons in the back of the brain, the basal ganglia. And when Anne was diagnosed, she had all the traditional symptoms, the slight tremors, the temporary bouts of paralysis. And her doctor put on a drug called Requip, which is a dopamine agonist. And these are one of the most effective treatments for Parkinson's. Dopamine agonists basically imitate the activity of dopamine in the brain. They bind to dopamine receptors, and what they allow for Parkinson's patients is they help compensate for the cell loss. And in the case of Anne, as she put it to me, this drug was like a miracle cure, that all her symptoms virtually disappeared. She could go back to teaching. It really worked out great. She was thrilled. One of the problems, though, with dopamine agonists for Parkinson's patients is that the cell death continues. And so over time, you're forced to go on higher and higher doses of the drug. And that's when Anne discovered a terrible side effect of dopamine agonists. It's a side effect that afflicts, some studies estimate, between 10 and 15% of all Parkinson's patients on these drugs. And the side effect in the case of Anne was that she became a slot machine addict. Gambling addiction is this very serious side effect. And I think the reason slot machine addiction is so dangerous, and we'll get back to this in a second, it's just the flip side of the prediction error signal. It's just the same very efficient, elegant algorithm, but in a different situation. And in the case of Anne, this addiction to slot machines ruined her life. She described a typical day to me like this. She'd wake up at 5 in the morning and go to the local racino. It's a dog racing track which has slot machines. She'd stay there, she'd get a bucket of quarters and stay there till about midnight when the racino closed. Then she'd go to the local convenience store, and because this is West Virginia, the local convenience store has slot machines where she would continue to gamble on these slot machines till 3 in the morning. Then she'd go home and play the slots on her computer, not for money, just for fun, until 5 in the morning, when she'd then go back to the racino. She'd keep this up for 2-3 days at a time. Needless to say, she completely ruined her life. She lost everything she had. She sold everything she had. She sold her car, her wedding ring. She stole coins from her grandkids. Her husband left her. As she described to me, she was living on peanut butter straight from the jar for months. That was all she had. And it wasn't until she was taken off this dopamine agonist in 2006 that the addiction disappeared. And it disappeared within a week, and she hasn't gambled since. So it really was this fairly sudden, dramatic shift. And I think one of the most poignant parts for me of Anne's story is that it never occurred to her that this addiction might be caused by her dopamine agonist, might be caused by this Parkinson's medication. It never occurred to her that this drug she takes for this debilitating set of movement problems might be related to this compulsion she'd suddenly developed. She never made the connection. She simply thought that she'd stumbled upon some sin that she couldn't resist, and discovered her Achilles heel, her mortal flaw. Now the question is, why would being on this dopamine agonist, why would this lead to slot machine addiction? Why would it lead to gambling compulsions? And I think this gets back to the prediction error signal. And one of the flip sides of the prediction error signal, which is that surprising rewards, so let's say you've trained the monkey on this elaborate paradigm, flashlight, ring a bell, squirt of juice. Let's say sometimes you just give a monkey a squirt of juice out of nowhere. So you don't flashlight or ring a bell first. You just give a monkey a squirt of juice. What happens then? So this is the positive side of a prediction error signal. This is a reward it didn't predict. Well, what you see then is that the monkey generates, these dopamine neurons generate a surge of dopamine that's 3 to 4 times larger than a predictable reward. So this signal is much stronger than a reward that they can predict. So when you flash a light, they respond and they send an action potential. But when you give them a squirt of juice they haven't expected, you get that same signal, but 3 to 4 times larger in magnitude. Now, the problem, this also makes sense, I should say, in terms of, let's say you're a monkey and you're scouring the rainforest or wherever you are, and you stumble upon an unexpected reward. This surge of dopamine is your brain's way of grabbing your attention, of saying, look, here's a reward you didn't expect. Maybe there are more rewards you can figure out. Maybe you should spend a little time, spend a little attention on this and try to find the patterns here. Try to find the event that may predict this unpredictable reward so you can maximize it. You can find more rewards. So this reveals how this feeling is really about seizing our attention, about getting us to pay attention to something new, something we didn't expect, so we can figure it out in the future. And in the case of Anne, in the case of so many of these patients on these dopamine agonists, I think the problem is they simply have too much dopamine floating around in their midbrain. And so the end result is they sit there at the slot machine. And the slot machine, of course, is one surprising reward after another. It's a random number generator, even though over the long term, everyone loses money at the slots. They're programmed to return somewhere between 75 and 90 cents in the dollar or the pound. And so everyone does badly over the long term. But in the short term, you get these surprising rewards. You get these coins in return. You'll get the sirens go off and the clanging coins. And so what your brain does, what these dopamine neurons are trying to do, is every time they get a reward, they try to predict it. They get the surge of dopamine, the surge of a surprising reward, and that's their impetus to try to figure out the event, whatever that event may be, that predicts this reward. But of course, there is no event that predicts this reward. It's a purely random event. The secret is there is no secret. And yet your dopamine neurons don't understand that. They don't get randomness. They weren't designed to deal with the stochasticity of a casino. And so the end result is you're transfixed by this system of surprising rewards. You're bled dry as your dopamine neurons respond to one surprising reward after another. And I think when you're on these dopamine agonists, you simply have too much dopamine and you're not able to generate what's called the override signal, to know that your life is being destroyed. Anne knew she was ruining her life, but she simply couldn't step away from the machines. So now that we know a bit about dopamine and our emotions and when they're good and when they can be so bad, and when we really should, I think, flex our prefrontal cortex, the quote-unquote rational brain, and try to generate that override signal and say we can ignore our fear and try to think straight. The question is, what can we do with this knowledge? And how can we apply this to everyday life? And this is where something called metacognition comes in handy. And I love metacognition because it's a really fancy-sounding word, but it describes something very simple, which is thinking about thinking. Probably one of the classic cases of metacognition is tip-of-the-tongue moments. So we all know tip-of-the-tongue moments. You're walking down the street and you bump into a high school acquaintance or a Facebook friend, someone you know their first name, but you can't quite produce it at that moment. It's a tip-of-the-tongue moment. And that always struck me as a very, very profound occurrence. How do we know what we don't know? How do we know that name is somewhere inside our head if we can't produce it? How do you know that memory's there if you can't actually remember it? And this gets back to metacognition. It shows that we're always naturally metacognitive. We're always thinking about how we think. We're always keeping some vague notion of all the memories and ideas and feelings unfolding inside our head. And so that leads to this frustrating feeling. But in the case of decision-making, metacognition can really be a crucial skill in the sense that now that we know a bit about when your emotions might be useful, when you should trust that fear, and when you should actually try to think and be deliberate. We know a bit about which situations most benefit from which type of thought process. We know a bit about the advantages and disadvantages of these two ways of making decisions. We know a bit about all these hardwired flaws from loss aversion to anchoring that take place inside your head. What metacognition allows you to do is to take this knowledge into account and apply it every day. So you're sitting there trying to make a decision about Cheerios, and you think, how should I be thinking about this? How should I be making this decision? And so in that sense, and I'd like to end on this note, I think that's what gives me optimism about this research. And it's important to note that the brain, for the most part, remains an utter, baffling mystery. And yet we are discovering these, I think, general, vague truisms that can really be applied to everyday life. And in that sense, I think learning about how we think, learning about how the brain, at a very basic level, the level of our dopamine neurons, makes decisions and thinks, that can help us make better decisions. So thank you everyone so much for coming tonight. It really was a tremendous honor and pleasure speaking. I look forward to answering a few questions.
Thanks, Jonah. That was fantastic. I'm just going to ask 2 or 3 questions before we open up. So the first question I want to ask is how important do you think it is, Jonah, that we actually know what's going on physiologically in our brains? I mean, couldn't we understand all the things that you've described simply by observing behavior? And indeed, don't most of the things that we do find out simply confirm observations that have been made by people who focused on behavior?
I think that's a great point. I think it's very, can everyone hear me? I think it's very easy to kind of oversell this new knowledge, this shiny new knowledge, and these pretty pictures of colorful colors superimposed on a silhouette of a skull, the classic fMRI image. I think it's very easy to realize that we may just have a neural correlate for something, but what really does that add to our knowledge? And I think in many cases it adds very little. And I think one of the drawbacks of this new field called neuroeconomics is that for the most part it's they're simply finding neurocorrelates for stuff that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky discovered 25 years ago by asking undergraduates about. So how much how much does it add to know that loss aversion is related to the amygdala? That's a very valid criticism. I would respond that I think in many cases it does add something, and it adds something important. One of the things it allows you to do is constrain your theories, is to better understand kind of how theories actually work, and to understand, to give a firm grounding to things which we may observe, and some experiments may observe and other experiments may not. So, the example I always think about is there's a pretty large literature on credit cards and why people spend more with credit cards. And so I talk in the book about this experiment done by MIT economists a decade ago, where they had people bid for Boston Celtics tickets. That's an NBA basketball team. One group had to bid with cash or check, and one group had to bid with credit cards. And what they found was that the group that bid with credit cards ended up bidding twice as much money as the group that bid with cash. And so this is part of a larger study in terms of there's something very deceptive about credit cards, and the question is why? I think it was a couple years ago that a neuroeconomist named George Lowenstein, along with Brian Knudsen at Stanford, Lowenstein's at Carnegie Mellon, they put undergraduates in a brain scanner, and they had to make everyday shopping decisions. So they had to decide whether or not to buy the new Harry Potter book or the new George Foreman grill. They wanted to replicate as accurately as you can inside, a brain scanner, inside a noisy coffin, what it's like to actually choose what to buy. And what they found is that many of our shopping decisions are based on this emotional tug of war inside the head. So when you show something they want, like a new Harry Potter book, a brain area called the nucleus accumbens, which releases lots of dopamine, is activated. And the activity of the nucleus accumbens correlates with how much you want this object on display. At the same time, however, when you show people the price tag, that the Harry Potter book costs 10 pounds or 11 pounds or 12 pounds or whatever, a brain area called the insula is turned on. The insula is generally associated with negative feelings, things like bodily pain, things like disgust, and it turns out the pain of having to pay for something. So it's this tug of war that really regulates what we buy. And so after the fact, if you put this data through your statistical algorithm, you can predict which objects people will buy based on the relative activation of these two brain areas. So if the NACC, the nucleus accumbens, is more active, they'll buy it. If the insula is more active, they won't buy it. The funny part about credit cards, and this is what they found in the experiment, is that when people pay with credit cards, the insula is much less active than normal. That because the transaction's abstract, because you're not literally taking cash out of your wallet and handing it over, your insula doesn't quite know what's going on. You're just swiping a plastic thing, and then it'll show up on a bill in 30 days. But what does that actually mean? The insula doesn't quite get it. And so the insula is less sensitive to the pain of paying. And the end result, these scientists argue, is that you spend too much money. So I think that's an example of how you actually do gain something from actually doing that in a brain scanner. I think it's important not to oversell it, and not to pretend that just because we can reduce the insula, we suddenly understand credit card debt. And I think the larger question is then, based on this knowledge, what does that imply about how we should change policy, and maybe how we should regulate credit cards, or change the way people can pay with credit cards? That's a whole separate set of questions. I'm not sure the insula can answer them. But I do think that's an example of how drilling down being a good reductionist, as a scientist would say, can actually add something new to how you think about the problem. Can not only help you reconceptualize shopping decisions as this emotional tug of war, which isn't exactly a rational process, which kind of contradicts one of the founding assumptions of microeconomics, the rational agent model, that you're really relying on the relative amount of pleasure and pain in terms of what you buy. But I think it also can help us reconceptualize credit card debt in general. So I think that's an example of how it can help. I mean, I often get frustrated, when you see, some shiny new paper that gets lots of headlines because they found the neural correlate of, sarcasm, or they've reduced love to the ventral striatum. Or, I think it's very easy to pretend these pictures are the holy grail and that we've suddenly solved romantic love because we can reduce it to, the dopamine reward pathway. But I think at the same time, there's lots of interesting stuff being found, and there are adding stuff to these models, many of which we've had for decades and decades.
I remember you posted in your blog a few weeks ago a debate that had been aroused by some researchers calling a lot of this neuroscience voodoo, talking about voodoo correlations based on that kind of rather crude process. Can I ask another question, which is about this particular moment? And obviously the kind of world's going through this kind of terrible time as a consequence of the economic crisis, and there's lots of reconsideration going on, new ideas. It feels to me as though 30 or 35 years ago, there came a moment when suddenly people felt the thing you really needed to understand if you were going to be a policymaker was how markets worked. And so that kind of provided the paradigm for a long time. It feels now as though increasingly what people are saying is the thing you really need to understand is how the mind works. And so, we've got your work, but you're one of a whole number of mainly American brilliant writers who are popularizing this kind of stuff. We had Richard Thaler over here, and nudge was a big thing, and of course Malcolm Gladwell and Jonathan Haidt and all these kinds of people. So how important do you think this moment is? And do you think our understanding of the ways in which our minds work are going to fundamentally change the way in which we think about ourselves and the way in which we approach social problems?
I hope it does fundamentally change. I hope breaking open the black box and getting a better understanding of how our mind works does change the way we think about our mind. I think it'd be slightly reckless of us if we didn't adjust these assumptions we have about the way the brain works. If we still clung to the rational agent model, if you're an economist, given the vast amount of data we have contradicting it from the perspective of the brain. So I think it'd be slightly irresponsible if we didn't adjust the way we think about ourselves based on this new data. At the same time, I think the big caveat as we transition from, I think, this worship of markets to perhaps this over-worship of the mind, is to not make the mistake that the paradigms and tools we have now are somehow omnipotent and know everything, and that a brain scan is a window into the soul. I think in terms of one of the big abstractions I'm always aware of when I write about a brain scan or write about someone measuring dopamine neurons in a monkey is that you're measuring individuals in isolation, which is a tremendous abstraction. Humans are social primates. We exist, we interact with each other, and yet there are so few fMRI papers, and this is just a method that was invented, it's called hyperscanning a couple of years ago, and until then, we can never study people interacting with each other in a brain scan. So, I mean, the most basic thing we do every day, which is talk to other people, exchange money with other people, talk to other people on the phone, or talk about investments, make plans with other people, we have no idea what happens in the brain when you do that. That's just been a complete and utter mystery. So that's just one small example of all the voids in our knowledge. And so I think if I were a policymaker, I think it may be tempting to all of a sudden have these brain scans have rigorous empirical proof of how the brain works and then want to construct policies based on that. But I think it's so important to remember is all those holes in that knowledge, is the fact that we have tools which can be very useful. fMRI, despite, I think, some voodoo correlations, and I think justified criticism for many fMRI papers, is an incredibly useful tool. But it's just a tool. It gives us a certain snapshot of the brain, in the same way measuring individual dopamine neurons gives us a certain snapshot of the brain. But to pretend that this data can really, I think, utterly transform, and it should be the basis of public policy, I think we're not quite there yet. So I think it's important to kind of bracket what we do know with the reminder of all the stuff we don't know.
Okay, just one more question from me before I open it up. I don't get paid, Jonah, unless I mention at least 2 other RSA events while I'm on the stage. So I just want to link an event we've got in a couple of weeks. We've got Elizabeth Gould coming here to receive the Benjamin Franklin Medal. And as many people will know, she did very powerful work on neurogenesis, the process of generating new neurons, and demonstrated that stress, anxiety, including status stress, inhibits the capacity for the brain to develop new brain cells. At lunchtime today, we had two authors who've written a book demonstrating pretty comprehensively that more unequal societies are societies that suffer from high levels of social pathology, mental illness, criminality, drug abuse, etc. And their argument is that in higher inequality societies, people suffer at all points, by the way, not just the poorest. The poorest suffer most, but actually it takes place throughout the whole spectrum. People suffer more from status anxiety, and that status anxiety reduces their kind of cognitive resilience, and this may be an expert. Now, I'm just interested, do you think that's a credible account?
Absolutely. I mean, I've had the pleasure of spending time with Elizabeth Gould and writing about her, and I think her work is profoundly important. I think it is one of the few examples, I think, of really solid neuroscience that I think there are immediate policy implications from. I think one of her data points that I always think of is she showed that if you stress a macaque monkey that's pregnant, so you just stress the mother, and it doesn't take that much. You can play a loud sound for 10 minutes in the morning. What you find is that the children, the offspring of this macaque mother, are born with reduced neurogenesis, reduced plasticity. That's I think a pretty profound idea. The idea that these babies, even if they're raised, they themselves are never stressed. Simply stressing out the mother, there's this linger in which their brains, the signal they're sent from their mother, simply, it's a tough world out there. You probably don't want to invest in a really big brain. So that's kind of the world they're born into. Their neurons have this vague sense of maybe we shouldn't make so many new neurons because maybe it's not that useful. Maybe we just have to hunker down. The brain's a very expensive organ to maintain and construct. So I mean that's something that I always think about, the immediate policy implications of that, about in terms of prenatal care. I mean, there I think you can extract immediate policy implications. I mean, I also think about, she did a really wonderful study where she raised macaque monkeys in three different conditions. One was highly enriched, so these monkeys had, lots of branches, lots of other monkeys to play with, lots of toys, lots of things to stimulate their minds. The second condition was kind of the middle class condition. They had a few fewer toys, a few less monkeys, a few fewer branches, all that. And then there was the deprived condition, which, as she'll tell you, the deprived condition is the way we normally treat monkeys. So they're just in a standard cage with maybe a toy or two. It turns out the deprived condition, and this is, I think, she's had to deal with lots of animal rights protesters, and I think one thing they miss is that her research has done more than anyone else to really show that the standard way we treat monkeys is not just cruel and bad to the monkeys and these primates, it actually warps your data. That when you stress out a monkey, you don't see neurogenesis. And one of the reasons I think we didn't see neurogenesis, 10 years ago, many scientists would say neurogenesis didn't exist. She was the one who shifted the paradigm. This was one of the three dogmas of modern neuroscience, that the adult brain doesn't make new neurons. And she shifted that and showed that you do make new neurons throughout your life. I think one of the reasons we didn't see that for so long is because we were keeping these animals, be it rats or higher primates, in these cages where they were so stressed that their brains literally shut down. And so back to these three different conditions. I think you can crudely approximate them as upper class, lots of toys; middle class, a few fewer toys; then the kind of lower class with very few toys and high stress. And what she found was that if you look at these brains at a very fine-grained level, so you're looking at dendritic density, the number of arbors, the number of neurons, the amount of neurogenesis, that there's very little distinction between the upper class and the middle class. However, that there was this dramatic distinction between the lower class, these monkeys who were put in standard cages, and the monkeys given a few toys. And what she argues is that there's a critical threshold, that at a certain point, enrichment kind of, the payback from enrichment kind of, they're diminishing returns in essence. But unless you cross a certain threshold, and certain threshold, which means a lack of stress, a lack of chronic stress, a certain amount of enrichment, that the brain really doesn't develop properly. And I think that should reconceptualize a lot of the ways we think about things like stress and status anxiety and enrichment, that these things aren't just states of mind. These things actually really warp your mind. And that, I think, should have immediate applications for public policy. So I mean, I'm just thrilled that she's getting the Ben Franklin Award.